Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Power Book of Podcasts. We're so glad you could join us today.
Yes, welcome. It's always a pleasure to see so much curiosity and thoughtfulness in our listeners.
Now, today's episode tackles some of the most pressing geopolitical flashpoints in the world right now, and, as you might guess, there's a lot to unpack. From tensions in Ukraine to global power realignments, we'll be delving into how historical context and strategic actions are shaping the present.
Indeed, Eleanor. And we'll also aim to explore the deeper implications behind these realignments, not just in terms of economic or military strategies, but also in how they redefine influence and identity among nations.
So, whether you're a seasoned policy wonk or just someone curious about how the world works on a grand scale, we think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. We've got some fascinating ideas and insights to share, so let's dive in.
Let's begin. As they say, history is the prologue, and there's much to learn from understanding where we've been and what's at stake.
To start, William, let's look at how history shapes perspective. Russia's viewpoint on NATO expansion isn't just about current geopolitics. It's deeply rooted in their historical sense of security and identity. For them, NATO represents more than a defensive alliance. It strikes at the heart of their strategic and existential priorities, making the Ukraine issue a profound flashpoint.
Precisely, Eleanor. Russia has long perceived NATO's eastward expansion as a direct threat, one that jeopardizes not just territorial security, but the very concept of Russia as a sovereign power. This perspective has roots stretching back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and even beyond, into centuries-old dynamics of power and influence in Eastern Europe.
It's like there's this historical memory in play, a collective understanding of vulnerability, almost. And NATO, as Russia sees it, isn't just a military alliance. It's a symbol of shifting power balances that challenge their place on the world stage.
Absolutely. And what's critical here is understanding the two narratives at work. The West, especially the United States, views NATO as a stabilizing force, promoting democracy and security. But from Russia's vantage point, it's an encroachment, a deliberate strategy to limit their influence, and ultimately, their autonomy.
And I imagine this clash of narratives only escalates tensions, right? Because if each side refuses to see the other's perspective, well, how do you even begin to negotiate or de-escalate?
Indeed, Eleanor. Take, for instance, Putin's terms for peace in Ukraine. From the West's viewpoint, they're utterly unacceptable, barring Ukraine from NATO, recognizing annexations of Crimea and other territories, all of it. But for Putin, these positions aren't just negotiable demands. They're prerequisites for Russia's survival, as he frames it. And therein lies the impasse.
What strikes me is how the West has often dismissed that framing. The idea seems to be, well, we don't view NATO as a threat, so neither should you. But, that's not how it works, is it? Because it's not about what we perceive, it's about what they perceive.
Precisely. This refusal to engage with Russia as a subject, rather than as a mere object of policy, has compounded the conflict. Since the end of the Cold War, the US and its allies have often operated under a kind of ideological hubris, assuming that liberal democracy is the inevitable endpoint for all nations. It's a perspective that leaves little room for differing worldviews, especially those rooted in historically authoritarian or state-driven models.
It's a bit like playing chess against someone who's playing poker. They're looking at the board, but with completely different rules in mind. And when the West ignores those rules, it risks miscalculating Russia's next moves entirely.
Well said. And those moves include strategies that don't just involve the battlefield, but also long-term geopolitical repositioning. Many analysts predict that the conflict in Ukraine may end, not through peace talks, but with a frozen state, a stalemate that lingers for decades. And that outcome would have far-reaching implications, not only for Ukraine, but for the broader balance of power in Europe.
Right? Because a frozen conflict doesn't mean stability. It means uncertainty, vulnerability, and honestly, the potential for future flashpoints. So even if the guns go silent, the deeper issues will still smolder.
Exactly. And those deeper issues will continue to shape not just the region, but also how global powers, both established and rising, interact in this increasingly multipolar world.
All right, building on these themes of geopolitical conflict and deep-seated narratives, let's pivot to another significant flashpoint, the Middle East. William, the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel marked a shocking escalation. And while much has been said about the attack itself, I think what really stands out is the intelligence and governance failures that made it possible. I mean, how does something this devastating slip through the cracks?
An indispensable question, Eleanor. Israel's intelligence apparatus has long been considered among the best globally. Yet this event underscores that no system, however robust, is infallible. The governance issues, in particular, are noteworthy. A fragmented political landscape in Israel, with leaders often prioritizing ideologically driven policies over pragmatic defense strategies, appears to have been a key factor. Warnings about potential vulnerabilities had reportedly surfaced, but were ignored, sidelined by internal political divisions.
It's a sobering reminder, isn't it? Even the most advanced systems can falter when leadership loses focus on shared priorities. Now that brings us to Iran and its connection to Hamas. How do you see Iran's role in all this? Because it seems more pragmatic than ideological.
That's correct, Eleanor. While Iran's ideological stance against Israel is well documented, its relationship with Hamas is more strategic than heartfelt. Remember, Hamas is Sunni and Arab, while Iran's leadership is Shia and Persian, a significant divide in Middle Eastern politics. Their alliance, such as it is, exists mainly as a tactic for Iran to project influence and disrupt stability in the region. The attack on October 7th aligns with this strategy, possibly aimed at derailing normalization talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia, an alliance that threatens Iran's regional aspirations.
That makes sense. It's like Iran's playing a calculated chess game, using proxies like Hamas to counter moves by Israel and its potential Arab partners. But looking at the bigger picture, where does this leave the Middle East as a whole? Are we seeing a reshuffling of old alliances?
We certainly are. The Abraham Accords, while lauded for bridging divides, have also solidified a growing coalition of Arab states aligning with Israel, chiefly against shared concerns about Iran. This reshuffling represents a distinct departure from the traditional U.S.-centric power structure in the region. The United States, while still influential, no longer maintains the singular dominance it once did. Instead, new alliances like these are shaping the geopolitical dynamics, underscoring a decentralized, multipolar Middle East.
And Peter Zeihan's insights come to mind here. He's highlighted how these shifting alliances are redefining the region's power play, and by extension, conversations about global stability. But it seems like with every new coalition, there's also a new point of tension, right?
Correct. The region's history, rife with overlapping grievances and rivalries, guarantees that any new alignment will face its own trials. And let's not forget, even as these shifts occur, existing forces like Iran are doubling down on strategies to maintain their influence. What's emerging here is less a pathway to lasting peace and more a recalibration of the balance of power, a state of flux that will likely persist for years to come.
What a volatile picture. It feels like for every step toward resolution, there's potential for unrest. And with that, we've barely scratched the surface. There's still so much to explore about broader geopolitical pressures, especially as they relate to rising and declining powers elsewhere. Speaking of shifting power dynamics, William, let's turn our lens to China. Beyond its well-publicized military rise, it seems like a lot of its challenges are internal. Demographic decline, internal corruption, and procurement inefficiencies are all eroding its overall stability. These aren't small cracks, right?
Not at all, Eleanor. In fact, these challenges paint a picture of a nation at a crossroads. While China has invested heavily in military modernization, reports suggest troubling vulnerabilities, like defective missiles and bolted-down submarine hatches, symptomatic of corruption riddling its ranks. Then there's the demographic crisis. Birth rates have plummeted so drastically that they make future growth or sustainability seem almost impossible without drastic measures.
You know, it's surprising that beneath the veneer of their global ambitions lies such fragility. And wouldn't this fundamentally impact their ability to exert influence, especially in something like a protracted conflict or global trade dependencies?
Absolutely. These systemic weaknesses ripple outward. Consider global trade, Eleanor. China's role as a hub of manufacturing depends on functional supply chains, reliable military defenses, and internal cohesion. As these cracks deepen, it forces global powers, even the United States, into reassessing naval strategies. Ensuring uninterrupted trade routes becomes paramount, especially as we see regions like the South China Sea increasingly volatile.
Which brings us to Mexico, right? Amid these uncertainties, they've become America's #1 trading partner. But, oh boy, the cartels and governance issues, they complicate things significantly. Where do you even begin fixing it?
It's a complex situation. Mexico's trade partnership is essential, especially with nearshoring reshaping global supply chains. However, their internal strife, ranging from cartel dominance to governance struggles, hampers their potential. Much of this ties back to their outdated constitution. Reforming this foundational document to address modern challenges, like regional jurisdiction over cartel-led provinces, is critical if Mexico is to achieve long-term stability.
And yet, constitutional reform sounds daunting, doesn't it? Especially when cartels fill the governance gaps in certain areas. Do you think there's an appetite, political will, for structural changes like this?
That's the key challenge, Eleanor. Mexico's constitution was designed for a pre-industrial era, envisioning little beyond basic governance frameworks. Modern judicial, trade, and enforcement needs demand far greater adaptability. So yes, political will is crucial, but it's also immensely delicate. Tackling cartels requires both reform measures and external partnerships, which historically have faced fierce resistance from Mexico's leadership.
Oh, absolutely. Resistance runs deep. And yet, without some form of collaboration, be it with the US or other regional allies, Mexico might find itself unable to fully leverage its prime position in trade. Speaking of leveraging positions, let's talk about energy strategies.
A timely pivot, Eleanor. The global energy landscape is another delicate balance. There's been tremendous push toward renewables, but we're quickly hitting roadblocks. Limited resources for green tech, grid instability, and over-reliance on intermittent sources like solar and wind. Many regions are discovering that failing to maintain a diversified energy mix leads to not just inefficiency, but outright reliability crises.
Right. And I mean, renewables alone can't shoulder the load, especially when demand spikes. Grid stability requires foresight, and solutions that work in one region might not fit others, or even scale effectively. Speaking of energy challenges, William, it's clear that balancing renewables with other power sources is a puzzle the world is still trying to solve. But isn't it fascinating how energy policies intertwine with broader global strategies?
Indeed, Eleanor. These discussions remind us just how interconnected our world truly is. Every decision, every alliance, it's all part of a larger narrative that shapes the future.
Exactly. And to our listeners, wherever you are, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into some of the most pressing issues on the global stage. Conversations like these are so much richer with your engagement, and we'd love to hear your perspectives.
Absolutely. Your insights and curiosity are what make discussions like these meaningful. If you have questions or thoughts, do share them. It's through collective dialogue that we learn and grow. And don't forget to subscribe and help our community grow.
And remember, the world's challenges can feel overwhelming, but understanding them, even just a little, helps us become more informed, empathetic, and proactive citizens. So keep asking questions, keep exploring.
Until next time, stay curious and thoughtful. Because as we always say, knowledge isn't just power, it's responsibility.
Thank you, everyone. Take care, and we'll see you soon on the next episode of the Power Book of Podcasts.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.